So here to talk more about the board's recent report on improving bus, streetcar, and other last mile transit access is our policy guru for transportation, Jonathan English, along with Uday Schultz from Harvard University, who was a supporting researcher on our report. I expect just about everyone watching right now is very familiar with John's work. He's been a major driving force behind much of the transit vision I've spoken this morning, and has been very active in bringing smart, well thought out transit recommendations to decision makers. John, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that introduction. Yeah, it has been a real great pleasure to help shape the board's agenda on transportation during my time here, and to work so closely with our business members to ensure we're promoting a future where people and goods can move around more efficiently and sustainably. So on that, before introducing our next panel, which is all about local transit and the movement of people, I just want to give a brief update on the work the board has done thus far to reimagine it, what regional transit could look like, especially in the context of reclaiming lost riders during the pandemic. So first off, I'm really happy that Uday is here. Uday is a student at Harvard University, and he's been helping me a lot with research and some of the analysis for the reports that we've done, and it's been a real pleasure working with him. So I'm happy to have him here. He's really reflecting the next generation of transportation. So the first comment I'd like to make is that service really matters. It's what gets people to ride, and that's what our latest report, Next Up, is all about. You know, throughout the region, we have a very extensive bus network, and we really are a global leader, certainly a North American leader in providing transit service, especially in suburban areas. A lot of places have, particularly within the city of Toronto, but increasingly outside the city of Toronto as well, as we'll hear, really, really impressive frequency of service. But there's still a lot more that we can do to make that service attractive. But the first step is that basic level of service. And that's why the board in its report called for a clear region-wide 10-minute frequency service standard all day, so that people can turn up and go and travel on major routes without having to worry about the schedule, where they can make connections without having to stand for a half an hour on a suburban street corner, which is not fun in today's weather or the past few weeks' weather. And then also the report talks about some of the other alternatives where that might not be feasible, like potentially on-demand service, which we'll hear about in the upcoming report, in the upcoming panel, pardon me. So I really encourage you to check out the report. It's got grounded recommendations for what we need, because we need to build universal transit access. We need to make it possible now more than ever for people to go from anywhere to anywhere in the region whenever they want to travel, because truly this is a single economic and social unit, our Toronto region, and we need a transit system that reflects that. You know, one of the most important elements of this, of making this all work, is also fair schedule and service coordination, so that transfers are seamless, even across agency and municipal boundaries. And this is something that we've seen in Erasing the Invisible Line, one of our earlier reports. So now I want to hand it over to Uday to present some other key aspects of affordably making transit more effective.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the introduction, Jonathan. And I just want to say how much of an honor it has been working in supporting your work and supporting the board's work generally over the past year. It's been really an incredible experience and opportunity. So thank you again. So, you know, I think building on some of the stuff you just touched on, I think the third really important component here is infrastructure. You know, across North America and across the world, there have been a lot of cities who've been rolling out low-cost sort of improvements like bus lanes and transit signal priority in support of you know, local transit improvement goals. And I think it's really critical that Toronto, you know, being home to some of the continent's busiest bus routes like Finch East and Don Mills and Jane, implements those fixes and does so in the near term to ensure that the ridership recovery is sort of as well supported infrastructurally and is as prioritized as it should be. in the longer run, I think, expanding that vision to include, some higher quality, more rapid transit-like bus corridors. So thinking towards BRT, consolidating stops, improved station experiences, improved transfers, might further support those investment priorities in the long run, and support local transit ridership growth in those senses too. And I think it's worth remembering that a lot of these bus routes, especially in sort of the outer parts of the region, are disproportionately carrying essential workers. And so as we're thinking as well about transit equity and how to sort of ensure that everybody is included in the ridership recovery and in the future of transit and the future of mobility, that we prioritize these modes and prioritize improvements on these corridors to sort of continue Toronto's exceptional success in providing local transit service across the region. I think the final component of this strategy then also must be thinking towards the future and how transit agencies and transit providers and transit thinkers can leverage innovation to support improved mobility and improved access across the region. I think we're really interested, and we talked about this some in the report, in integrations with micromobility technologies, integrations with bike share, integrations with other transit service providers to maximize access and maximize mobility in the region and bring trip types that might not be particularly well served by more conventional transit alternatives into the network and into the service portfolio transit providers can offer. I think the innovation commitment also involves a facet of process reform and trying to leverage technologies, whether it be sort of digital twins or advanced planning techniques, to really maximize the sort of impact and efficacy of the investments and improvements we make, and really ensure we're leveraging our funds and our time to maximally support ridership and maximally support mobility and access and equity goals across the region. So back to you, Jonathan. Thank you again.
Thanks so much again, Uday. And I just want to reinforce the importance of that. Essential workers are traveling, and they're not traveling 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. They're traveling at all times of day. And this is the type of transit that we desperately need to provide so that these essential workers have as easy and as seamless a trip as possible to their jobs. So speaking of transit frequency, I want to hear from you in our next poll, which has just opened. So that's in the polling feature to the right of your screen, just next to the questions. The poll asks, what's the minimum frequency for transit to arrive for you to use it? And I'll be commenting on your responses at the close of this session. So to kick off the panel that I'm really excited to hear, I'd like to introduce our great moderator, the Globe and Mail's Oliver Moore. Oliver has 2 decades of experience reporting, and he frequently writes about cities and urban policy. So thanks for being here, Oliver, and over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Jonathan. I'm very glad to be here for the summit, and I appreciate the board inviting me to moderate this discussion on integrating and improving local transit. It's interesting because the fireside chat talked a bit about lived experience. And, I write a fair bit about transit, but my personal lived experience is I'm a resident of Toronto. And so when I ride transit, I most often ride on the TTC. I ride less often on GO, and I don't ride 905 transit that much. So I think, frankly, this is going to be an interesting discussion to me personally, because it's going to give me a bit of a better understanding of a world I have only a glancing familiarity with. But I think also it's an interesting discussion for our audience. So thank you for joining us, everyone who's out there, for what is probably your 700th Zoom session of the last 2 years. I really appreciate you being with us today. Settle in, get yourself a cup of coffee or tea, or depending on your time zone, maybe something more robust, because I think this is going to be an excellent discussion. We have a great panel. First up is Christopher Norris, Deputy General Manager of Durham Region Transit. Durham Region is piloting an on-demand transit project aiming to provide universal access while also committing to fixed route service frequent enough that no rider has to wait more than 30 minutes for a bus. Look forward to hearing more about that, whether 30 minutes is fast enough, but it's a good start, I think. Next on the panel, we have Wendy Reuter, Head of Research and Analytics at the Toronto Transit Commission. The TTC, which is the most heavily used urban transit system in Canada and the 3rd largest in North America, is embarking on several major network expansion projects while managing at the same time decreased ridership due to the pandemic. We also have Stephen Farber, Associate Professor in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto. Stephen's research investigates the social and economic outcomes of transportation policy in urban areas. He focuses on addressing key equity challenges. He's on the editorial board of 3 international transportation journals and chairs a transit-oriented research committee at the US National Academies of Science. And finally, our 4th panelist is Sue Connor. She is the past chair of the Canadian Urban Transit Association, the current chair of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, and she is the director of transit at the City of Burlington. Sue came to that role from a similar job at the City of Brampton, where she presided over a major service expansion that led to unprecedented ridership growth. So Sue has a very good view, I think, on local transit networks across the region. Welcome to all 4 of you. Thank you for being here for today. To our audience, if you have anything you want to ask our panelists, you will have a chance towards the end, so please do so through the Q&A feature on our right. While you're thinking about your questions, I'll start with a few of my own. And I think I'll go to Sue first, because I think what the experience in both Brampton and Burlington is very interesting to me. While you were in Brampton, you presided over service expansion that led to a more than doubling of transit ridership in a single decade. And I think almost any agency would think that is a very big deal. Now you've been leading expansion in Burlington. So tell us, on the most macro level to the most micro, how do you get people to ride transit in suburban communities?
Well, I think all of our travel times and frequency of service are the biggest factors to increasing transit ridership in a suburban community. In Brampton and in Burlington, we moved from a hub-based routing system to a grid network. This reduces travel time. You are not forcing passengers to travel extra time to a hub to make a transfer. In Burlington, we moved to a grid network in September of 2019. In the first 6 months of service before the pandemic hit our success in the face, we saw a 14% ridership growth in a community that really hadn't seen much increase in ridership for many, many years. So we were on the right path. Transit priority measures can also help reduce travel times, like transit signal priority and infrastructure at intersections that separate buses in a separate lane so that they can get around the traffic and stay on schedule. Real-time travel information for passengers is also a big factor. And in fact, in Brampton, when we put the intersection improvements in, one benefit we never even thought of, it really benefited emergency services that were able to bypass the traffic gridlock at an intersection and, on an emergency call. So it was win-win benefit that we hadn't even thought of. Frequency of service is a big factor. Most people are only prepared to wait 15 minutes for a bus. We have produced a 5-year business plan in Burlington, and that helps us to get a vision for our municipal council and provides support for our annual operating and capital budget process. It just gets buy-in from council, and that's really important. In Burlington, our 5-year business plan recommends that we add 4 growth buses per year until we achieve a 15-minute level of frequency on all of our routes, which we feel will support the increase in transit ridership within our community. The GTHA Presto fare card also makes travel seamless for passengers that are transferring to other local transit systems or to GO Transit. Burlington is planning for major intensification and transit supportive development around the 3 GO stations in Burlington. So we're working with our planning group to see how transit can be improved and what measures we can put to support transit in those communities. Another initiative in Burlington is we are working on an integrated mobility plan, which will plan for the future transportation and mobility needs for the community without road widening. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to bring to the panel today.
Thanks, Sue. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of that for me, when I think of some of the articles I've done during the pandemic, is moving away from the hub and spoke. And you didn't mention this as a reason, but a lot of the agencies I've spoken to have said that, with pandemic ridership down, what will save agencies is the everywhere to everywhere service. That transit is not about getting into the central business district to get to work, though that's one part of it. It's using transit for all parts of your life. And so I think the grid system obviously helps with that. Stephen, let's go over to you. Your research often explores the idea of universal accessibility. In theory, transit is the most universally accessible thing possible. Anyone can pay a fare and walk on. Practical reality, of course, is it's not that simple. Tell us a little bit, what are some of the more serious equity challenges faced by transit users in the Toronto region?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And also thanks to the previous remarks from the other speakers. It's been great to hear your thoughts so far. Yeah, transportation, I think this audience really understands how essential transportation is for societies and economies to function. But it's often really important when we're thinking about transportation equity to take the perspective of a single individual and trying to understand how fundamental being able to travel is to one's own economic participation, one's own social exclusion, and one's own health and quality of life and well-being. And universal accessibility promotes the concept that all people, regardless of their wealth or ability, should have the right to the means necessary to participate at normal levels in society, whatever those norms are. And, unfortunately, a lot of our research shows that we're not really achieving that goal of enabling people to participate normally in society. And some of the equity issues that we see really have to do with this combination of poverty, material poverty, in combination with where people are today living in poverty. And we're finding that more and more people are actually living below the poverty line out in the GTA suburbs, where we find it very, very difficult to serve with reliable, frequent service, grid-based transportation networks, everything that we've been talking about. And really because of this, the research is showing that this combination of poverty and lower levels of transit supply actually result in people not being able to participate in their regular daily activities, things that you and I take for granted. And this really entrenches inequalities in our region. And, we have pretty strong evidence that this suppression of participation could be alleviated if we make the right investments in public transportation today. And I recognize that this panel is really all about improving transit delivery and focusing on that local transit need. But as a researcher of transportation equity in general, I really have to point out that one of the gravest affronts to a more equitable transportation future is our continued development of automobile-dependent suburbs, and that's largely fueled by infrastructure investments, specifically in highway construction. So despite the awful congestion that we have in the GTA, drivers in the GTA today are still better off than the typical transit user. And in fact, rather than trying to solve a congestion problem, we need to be focusing our efforts on improving the well-being and the experience and the opportunity for those who are already worse off than almost every driver in the region when it comes to universal accessibility. And until we provide those opportunities to those underserved by the alternatives, to the automobile, we really won't be achieving that equity that we need. And on the flip side, if we are able to reach that goal, we will be able to, close that participation gap and unlock that participation amongst all of these people who are currently kind of isolated and not able to reach their full potential, regardless of their class and ability. And this is the promise of universal accessibility. This is what I hope we will be able to achieve beyond ridership figures and the economic case. I really hope that we'll be able to achieve that greater level of equity and social inclusion that our region so badly needs. And that's why we need to be prioritizing universal accessibility over other competing and attractive transportation goals that we have in the region.
I think that's such an important point, Stephen. Thanks for that, because when drivers talk about congestion, and this does not in any way take away from their experience, but the reality for transit riders invariably is worse. The average transit commute is considerably longer than the average driving commute. You wouldn't necessarily hear that to hear the political discourse, but that is the reality. Wendy, let's go over to you now. I mean, obviously, the TTC is the biggest transit player in the country, but it is also a local transit agency. I mean, people come in from Vaughan on the Young Line, but a lot of people in the city use it as their local transit agency. Ridership is down massively at the TTC as long as everywhere else, but the TTC, of course, it's a bigger number. We're obviously in a marathon here. COVID is not over as fast as maybe some of us might have wanted. So what lessons can the TTC share on how to adapt and evolve to what is still an ongoing and unusual situation?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. It certainly is, and you're right on the money. Ridership has been down throughout the pandemic, and just to recap, it was at 15% early on, and as recently as December of last year, we were at 50% of pre-COVID levels. It's really been driven. Use has really been driven by public health waves and who needed to travel in each of those waves that were enabled for people to move around. TTC is a really large transit agency. You know, we had 1.7 million riders every day prior to COVID, and 70% of those riders were surface. Think of downtown and streetcar and subway, but a very significant amount of our ridership is in the suburban areas of Toronto on our surface routes. The entire network, as you mentioned, is extremely large. It's the third largest transit agency in North America. And with that, with the build out, about 90% of Toronto's population have access to our subways, streetcars, or bus routes within 5 minutes. So coverage is there. And in terms of frequency of service, there's a 10-minute service on 62 of our routes. So you know, the frequency of service is already embedded in the service that we provide to residents of Toronto. Throughout the pandemic, our focus really was twofold. First, service. We know how dependent Torontonians are on transit service. And by maintaining the level of service, we were able to support our customers and the public to continue to move about as readily as they could under the constraints that COVID brought. And the other is really around safety first priority and learning the needs that our customers had throughout the pandemic. What new public health measures needed to be considered, and ensuring those were embedded in our service. So those were the focuses during COVID. But by providing a very high level of service during COVID allowed us to see, as customers were moving about, is the diversity of customer needs. You know, the COVID and the level of service revealed patterns of customer needs that weren't available for us to understand previously, and it's another level of understanding of our customers than we had prior to COVID. And I pick up on Stephen's comments about taking it even further as we move forward and moving from understanding our customers on a segment level. What do CEOs need to need? But also understanding at the demographic and individual level. So I'd say that's one of two new themes that we have coming out of our work at TTC.
Thanks for that, Wendy. And I think actually the point about
certainly still a continued focus on how we can people faster going forward. Sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
The opportunity to invest further in rapid transit routes. TTC currently has 4 priority corridors identified for BRTs in the suburban areas so that we're able to accommodate more people moving faster. And we're examining 20 corridors for transit signal priority to ensure that we can be moving towards that goal of enabling fast movement and that will compete against the thoughts of moving by car as well. So continued investment in how we can move people faster, more people faster, but this new view of how can we understand the individual needs of our customers more? How can we use the insights that we've gained through COVID, and how can we use the data and innovation that's occurred during COVID and revealed itself to better understand the needs of our customers going forward. Their trips are going to change. Their trips are going to change because of investments in transit-oriented development. Their trips are going to change because of in dynamics. Their trips are going to change based as their society shifts. And how do we better understand the unique needs of our customers as those shifts take place? How do we better understand their origin and their destination, their anywhere to anywhere trips? And using the data and the technology that have emerged in the last number of years to help inform our planning for customer needs over the coming years. The last piece is really, we still have a good portion of customers that were traveling with us prior to COVID that haven't experienced transit over the last 2 years. They've had options to either stay at home or move in different ways, and finding ways to encourage that reconnection back into the service. Majority of customers that are using transit part of our system for some time are reticent, and so you'll see agencies like ours doing outreach to customers where we normally connect with them while they're riding our systems. We need to find ways to connect with them in advance of them riding our systems, so we can share information about the safety that's in place. We can share information about what's now developed for them, and we can inspire them to be leveraging transit as they get reintroduced to the new their new movements as things open up through COVID.
Well, it's fascinating to think that this allowed the agency to sort of learn more about its customers. I mean, obviously, no one would will this for this reason, but it's one of many ways I think that the pandemic exposed a certain aspect of society that we hadn't seen before, or was changed, and allowed us to study it in a kind of a real world experiment. Christopher, I'm interested in learning more about Durham Region's transit strategies, because I think some of them will come as a surprise to people who underestimate suburban transit. Tell us a little bit about how the plans were developed and what the result on the ground might be. I mean, paint a picture. How tangible is it for me if I'm a Durham Region resident?
Thanks very much, Oliver, and thanks to the board for having me. A bit about Durham. So we're fast-growing region. There's 700,000 residents right now. We're going to grow to 1.2 million by 2041. We're also the largest geographical area in the GTHA. The Durham's 2,600 square kilometers, and today you can get to every square kilometer with transit. A large part of that is rural area. There's a significant urban area, but a lot of it is farms and communities that are bordering Northumberland County, Simcoe County, and even some of that York region. So how do we get there? So really from a customer's perspective, what are some of those network principles that we wanted the customers to be able to do? A lot of these concepts have resonated through the discussion. So fast, frequent, direct. We're also talking about spontaneous trip making. So minimizing wait times, being able to be competitive to the travel. So since about 2016, DRT, we've been undertaking several service strategies to be able to implement that. And about 5 years ago, we got into the demand response on-demand framework. And along comes significant event, which is COVID-19, which essentially threw a lot of our legacy markets up in the air. So our Go commuter markets, we had out in Ajax, we had about 1 in 5 customers riding Go Transit out of Ajax were using DRT services to connect there. UPass, moving away from in-person activities to leisure and all that has had tremendous impacts. And it also started to question ourselves as okay, well, we need to look away from what our legacy markets are because we don't know when they're going to come back. They're still important to us, but how do we build and continue the transit service to support essential travel for those workers that need to support the ongoing movement of society, but also how do we get out and help to what Stephen was saying and providing some of that universal accessibility and those residents that may not have the same advantages or privileges on a social economics status, so that they can go outside, they can access parks, conservation areas, and whatnot. So that really led us to a comprehensive network strategy where really at the core it's that rapid transit. So we've got the Gold Lakeshore East Line and that coveted extension towards Bowmanville through Oshawa's downtown, our coveted Durham Scarborough BRT along Highway 2 and Ellesmere linking to the future extension of the Danforth line, the Simcoe Rapid Transit Corridor connecting Oshawa's downtown with significant post-secondary institutions, Ontario Tech University, Durham College, Trent, and that's supplemented by our Pulse Rapid Bus service, and that's where you're getting a lot of the frequency on those main corridors, where we're offering that 10-minute headway across there. Currently, it's on Highway 2 in Simcoe, but those corridors are going to go from 2 to 5 by 2025. And then you mentioned about that base 30-minute service. So we've got those base routes, but what's that first access of transit service in Durham now is that on demand, what we've called on demand. And if you don't have access to scheduled service or the demand is really suppressed, especially in COVID times, you always have access to on demand, and that's 24 hours a day. So back in September, we launched 24-hour service throughout the region, and then you can get pretty much anywhere. So in the past, where lower demand, we'd stop scheduled service around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, depending on travel patterns. That may occur today, but you're always going to have that safety net that's on demand, and you're able to book that trip and connect with either scheduled services or Go Transit service. So and that's really important for us. And the on-demand service provides us with a really interesting opportunity, because right now you can go into our app or call us depending on your preference, and in the urban area your average wait time to get a trip is about 7 minutes. So that's phenomenal, and that's what we want to be able to do to really be competitive and provide a really viable alternative, not just for all of our market segments, and really make transit attractive in that suburban and even the rural areas that we have. Is as you go north in Durham, you move away from that attraction, which is Toronto Central Business District, and you're going into the York regions, the Lindsays, and the Barriers and the Aurelias, and that's how far north we go up to Lake Simcoe. So being able to provide that opportunity for travel at a pretty competitive fare, so that base Presto fare will get you from Newtonville out in the municipality in Clarington all the way up to Scarborough, or all the way up to Beaverton. So really great value, and hoping to build on that into the future, and creating more of those frequent transit corridors, but also ensuring that every area has access to that base public transit service.
Thanks. That sounds great. I mean, I'll certainly be watching the on-demand transit, because that seems like a bit of a holy grail to pull that off at a cost-effective way. So I'm certainly going to watch that closely, because that'd be great if that could be made to work. Let's talk, everyone, about integration. And everyone wants seamless travel. Everyone wants to get on one vehicle, mesh with another vehicle, mesh with another route, preferably only pay once. I've been in many cities in the world where you can do that. I've not been able to do that in Toronto, and there's a million reasons for that. I get that, but let's talk high level and get as granular then from that as you want. What needs to happen to get services and fares integrated throughout the various transit agencies in the region? I mean, happy to start with, say, Sue, who's worked at 2 different agencies in the region in recent times, so maybe has a bit more perspective on this.
Well, Oliver, it has been an ongoing issue, but currently the MTO has a fare and service integration table that's been ongoing for a few months now, since last fall. So there are a lot of initiatives that are being looked through that table. I can't really go through those with you right now, but I'm hopeful that, that work is going to shed some real positive results for the whole GTHA.
And also, how about Wendy? With the TTC, obviously the biggest player in any integration scenario. What do you think about this?
Sure. I mean, this is an important consideration. Right now, about 12% of TTC customers come from outside of the 416 area, and that demand is going to grow. And we need to be thinking about it in terms of how we can support that conversion from the automobile too. So this is an important topic. As Sue mentioned, there's the table through MTO. TTC has been participating in that, identifying how, what are the barriers to be doing this, and where there are opportunities for working together with local agencies and the province. So there's more work to do on that. There's some legislative barriers in the City of Toronto Act as well, that we need to maneuver through. So that's part of the plan. And we're identifying a path to move forward towards that. In fact, looking at how we can be thinking about fares differently, TTC has an initiative around a fares policy that's underway right now, and also how we're working with agencies in the cross-boundary opportunity right now. And both of those initiatives, as a matter of fact, have reports going to the TTC board today for meeting this week. So it's part of our commitment moving in this direction. But as Sue mentioned, it needs a lot of parties coming together to work through this together.
We're actually very short on time, but I'm going to squeeze in one little last quick one, if I could, Stephen, if you could try and make this quick. There was discussion in the last panel or last chat about transit-oriented development. From an equity point of view, is it a long-term model to put a lot of towers right on top of a subway station and then have sort of single-family homes as far as the horizon stretches? Or does the sort of broader model have to change with how that's done?
Yeah, I think that towers on top of transit stations is a great idea. The contents of those towers matter tremendously. Are we building studio apartments and no community services that would support a diverse community living in those locations? Or are we building communities that we think are appropriate, housing that's appropriate? And there's such a thing as appropriate housing at high density, whether it's in towers or or 8-story buildings or whatnot. And we don't have a lot of examples of success in that space in the Toronto area. The mixed use component is absolutely crucial, and we've got quite a lot of research happening in the School of Cities with Maddie Semiotiki's lab, looking at how we get serious about ensuring that there are community resources located in these high density transit-oriented developments. The last thing that I really want to point out is, transportation planners and governments, we need to acknowledge that there are risks associated with transit-oriented development. There are gentrification risks. There are winners and losers whenever the urban form changes, especially when it changes quickly or drastically as a result of an infrastructure investment. And we do need to acknowledge those challenges and get serious about having a set of policies that help empower and protect communities that we are trying to serve with our investments, and to, as much as possible, ameliorate the risks of simply displacing those populations or creating neighborhoods that are no longer suitable for them or affordable to them.
Absolutely. That is, I think, all the time we have. So thank you to Sue and Christopher, Stephen and Wendy for taking the time today to share your thoughts and your insight. Thank you to the audience for listening in and for all your excellent questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to go through more of them than I did, but I really appreciate that. Well, that was a good look at local transit, a regional look at local transit, I suppose you would say. But of course, we could always look at international best practices as well. Toronto's not always great at looking at what other people are doing, so I think that we should maybe do a little more of that. So now I'd like to invite Sunny Zhang, a process improvement specialist at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority's Long Island Railroad, to provide some brief comments on how New York is tackling local transit needs. Sunny, over to you.
Hi. you all hear me? There's a slide deck that is supposed to be shown right now. There you go. So my name is Sunny, and I work for the Law on the Railroad, and we've done a lot of initiatives in the past few years to improve the quantity and quality of real-time data we've provided to customers. Next. So we actually started our initiative well before the pandemic hit. We operate a system that in 2018 and 19 was very much at capacity. And the question then was not really a matter of crowding, more so, how do we make use of the capacity we have? We need people to walk to the other end of the train. We have a very constrained infrastructure. So we started this initiative 2 to 3 years before the pandemic, and we were just about done with it when the pandemic actually hit. So we were able to expedite it to get the data out. And obviously the use case for the data has moved from moving people around within the train to moving people between trains to how do we best provide our own service and measure our own data. Next. We have the benefit of a fleet that is 90% electrical multiple units, something that I know a lot of agencies do not have. And almost basically every electric multiple unit has a means to measure its own weight. This goes back over a century, in fact, and the older cars use an analog system, but the newer cars basically have these suspension airbags that have sensors that measure the pressure on it. And we thought, okay, we already have these sensors, we already have this equipment installed in the car. Why don't we use that to determine car capacity? So obviously that leads us with 3 challenges. First, to get it off the car, then to make sure it's calibrated for each car, and to see how accurate it is. Thankfully, we found these to be incredibly easy. We had an existing wayside network we can talk to for the first point. We just had to add the value. Calibration, it turned out that it was a constant, more or less. It was a linear relationship. As long as we could get an accurate weight of the empty car, the change for each passenger is more or less constant, which meant that it proved to be quite accurate, even though we couldn't really test that in the beginning of the pandemic with emptier trains. But as trains started filling up again, we found that the data was in fact quite accurate. Next. So then we sought out to incorporate this data into as many customer-facing channels as we could. So here are 3 screenshots of our Train Time app, which you can download today. So on the left, we present the various trip times available to the user, including historical crowding information so they can pick a train. In the middle is as they're about to board the train, we can tell them what cars and what region of the train might have more room. And finally, we implemented a feature that we believe is the first of any agency, where we take the user's GPS location and compare that with that of the platform extents, which are known, as well as the platform information for the train, because the trains stop at fixed points for a given train length. And we're able to plot the train against the user and the platform for them in the app before the train even arrives. So they don't have to run up and down the platform when the train is there to find an open car. Next. For those passengers who prefer not to use the app, as we implemented various signage redesigns in the past 2 years, we sought to incorporate crowding data into as many sign designs as possible. Here are 3 of our signage systems of varying vintages: LED, LCD, and monochrome LED. And we work with the limitations of the data that we have to put this data on the signs. Next. As the pandemic drew on and ridership started to return, the last case became much more important for our data. We previously had biannual surveys of all trains as they passed through Jamaica, which is our central hub, which cost over $100,000 in costs for contract surveyors to go out and count trains. Obviously, with COVID, we had to do it a lot more often. So the savings are actually more than $100,000 now that we can automatically collect just about every single train's ridership. It allows us to accurately determine patterns of loading, special event loading, when to add cars, add trains, or cut trains, as we had to do many times in the past 2 years. These tools are available on a semi-public page. You can visit it now at radar.milirr.org. This is not a truly public link, but it's a link that we give to all our employees to locate trains in our system and to determine possible crowding pinch points for ticket agents, for customer service, and for operations management. Next. So here are some takeaways from this project that I think would be very applicable to other agencies. First, be aware that any new system and any new sensor that you want to put on your equipment, especially if you're talking about hundreds or 1,000 cars, is incredibly expensive. Look carefully at what you already have on your equipment. And even though you may have to make modifications to get the data off the car or additional calculations on the back end, it's probably cheaper than building a whole new system. Second point is we need to focus on accuracy. In fact, we actually user tested some of these designs pre-pandemic, and the most common response was, this data is inaccurate, the railroad is lying, I will never listen to it. So you need to win your customers' trust by providing accurate data first. Once you've won their trust, you can start making the data in ways that they'll probably use it, and don't worry about making it look nice anywhere near the start. Next, we did this project entirely in-house. Back up. We did this project entirely in-house using in-house folks, myself and a couple others. It saved us a lot of consultant fees. And while I understand that for smaller agencies, this is not exactly possible, try to find in-house talent. I'm sure you'll find something. And the next bullet is kind of key into that. It's less important that you get someone with the technical chops to program this. If you must outsource the programming, that's all right. It's much more important that you have someone working on these initiatives who understands how the railroad runs, how your service operates, from a perspective akin to that of a dispatcher, but ideally you want someone a little less operationally connected so you can actually see the bigger picture. But you want someone who understands what the field can do, what the field does in practice, so you know the edge cases and you can design for them. Next. And finally, we've gotten amazing reviews from our customers. It's worked out great for us. We've got numerous agencies who've asked about this, and I encourage everyone to please consider looking at some of the systems that we looked at, Loadway and in-house work as a way to advance, especially in a major metropolitan area like Toronto. Thank you.
I would really like to thank you, Sunny, for that fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed seeing, these really creative, rapidly developed, and innovative solutions that you've been working on at the LIRR. Just before we move on, I really want to talk quickly about the poll results that we've seen. It's fascinating to see this, and I think very, very instructive. Only we asked what's the minimum frequency for transit to arrive for you to use it. Not a single person said once per hour. Only 2% of people said every half an hour. But fully 58% of people said every 15 minutes. And that matches up with a lot of the academic research. 40% of people said they want a vehicle to come better than every 10 minutes. So, I think this is really a key lesson here when we're trying to attract riders to transit. It's that 15-minute or even 10-minute service that is going to get people on transit or back on transit.